The book, please get up for John and Ian.
Ladies and gentlemen, John Robb. So John, it's a pleasure. I just saw you a few nights ago in Manchester.
It is weird, isn't it? I saw you in my backyard, and now you'll see me in your
That's
backyard.
right.
Yeah.
And I didn't even know about this book. And then I was alerted to it, and I said, I need to know about this. This book fills a huge void. The history of rock and roll has been exhaustively researched and written about. Almost every moment has been cataloged and examined, except for goth music, which is strangely is not subject to any of this scrutiny. And I'm wondering if it's because of why that is.
Well, that interested me as well. When I started writing it, before I started writing the book, you could see a big gap there of bands, to me, that should have been celebrated more, but were never celebrated, never written about, never understood. And a scene that was really popular and really influential worldwide, that never really been examined. There have been academic books on goth, but I don't really count academic music books as proper music books. They're too dry, aren't they? You know, I think a pop culture book, a book where people, understand a fan's point of view, but you do the deep dive and you unpack it all, but you have to love the music as well. Like John Savage's England's Dreaming is a really brilliant book on punk rock, because John Savage, even though he is a very academic writer, is also a fan, and they're my favourite kind of books. Yeah. So I saw that there was a definite gap there of these bands, and it should have been far more celebrated. I mean, it was celebrated by musicians more than by the media. It was a really weird thing. So as I started writing the book, and as people started talking about the book, as it started to come out, you could feel there's a sea change. And now, weirdly, most of the magazine covers in Britain this year seem to have had goth things on them.
Yeah, what do you account for the huge resurgence in what's called goth music with, some of the, the huge interest in, like, The Cure, for example, or Susie, or Bauhaus? I mean, the biggest stadium acts right now are what you would call goth music. But actually, before we talk about that, maybe one thing is that the umbrella for this term is so amorphous and kind of ill-defined, and maybe that's part of why people don't kind of address it as a...
Yeah, I think one of the main problems is all the bands hate being called goth bands. I mean,
it's almost a pejorative.
Yeah, it's a recurring theme in the book that every chapter I have to explain why this band is not actually a goth band, brackets, it is really. So it's because it's actually a term. The bands are already going for about... I mean, Susie's first gig was in September 1976, and the term goth is not applied to a music scene until about 82, 83. So that's like 6 years when you're just doing something else completely different. Suddenly you're corralled into a scene with expectations, which you as a musician would find frustrating as well. I'm sure you do, because you seem to spend your whole career zigzagging as far away from any expectation as possible. So I think any true artist does that, don't they? And I think that's a sign of the strength of the bands, I think, that they're sort of post-genre. But on the same token, it's a great shorthand term for a music scene, isn't it? So if somebody says to me, there's a really great band in a house over there, I'm probably pointing at your house here actually, but there's a really good band in that house, and I go, what they like? And somebody say they're kind of gothy post-punk. I'll go, that sounds interesting, I will check them out. So it's a shorthand term that captures a mood and an idea without imprisoning the person into a scene, isn't it?
Well, it's interesting. So you talk about Susie, and Susie is, of course, one of the original English punk rockers. But maybe goth is, but as punk became kind of overly obsessed with authenticity and politics and real life concerns, then goth is this kind of rejection of reality, or a kind of like embrace of poetic kind of, sort of, the dream world or something. What you call in the book Dionysian.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and also psychedelic in a way. It's like a monochromatic psychedelia, a different kind of psychedelia. So the Cure's Pornography album, which is an amazing record, very dense, very dark, but also mind-alteringly psychedelic. But it was a very late 70s, early 80s psychedelia, isn't it? So it fucks your mind and it twists your mind, but it's not Paisley patterns, West Coast psychedelia. Although when we talk about the West Coast here, we have to mention the Doors, because the Doors, as I write about in the book, were the first band to be termed Gothic and are the archetype, really. You know, I think even though they're not strictly a goth band, obviously, but their influence hangs so heavily over the whole scene. And interesting enough with the Doors, is another band that aren't in England, aren't really embraced by music critics that much. You know, they're a band very much on the outside.
They're
People
reviled,
look down on them.
like
Yeah,
goth,
they are.
like goth music. The
people
Doors are reviled, but we love them.
But people see them as being pretentious, but I think pretension is a quality.
It's
in music.
a positive attribute, pretentious. Well, that's interesting because a huge aspect of the '60s, which is sort of, ignored by music journalism, is the kind of gothic. The gothic aspect of the '60s, and the obsession with Aubrey Beardsley and all this stuff.
That's especially true of the Doors. I think they really coalesced it. I mean, before there'd been hints of it. Obviously, Painted Black by the Rolling Stones, perfect title, isn't it? If you're going to write a book on goth, I was thinking maybe I could use that, but then in fact I used Art of Darkness, and the book company I was on at the time before I fell out with them didn't know what I meant. They said, why are you calling it the Art of Darkness? And I said, it's a pun on the Heart of Darkness, and they didn't know what the Heart of Darkness was. That's the state of publishing these days. I thought everybody knew the Heart of Darkness. Even people don't read books have heard of that book, haven't they? But the Doors played a gig in New York City in '67, and the reviewer said they had gothic overtones to their music. And there are some people who do say to me, why are they in the book? They're not a goth band. Or I have to explain. Well, Jim Morrison, sang in a baritone, head to toe in black, was fascinated by romantic poetry and sex and death. It's all there in one go, isn't it? And then in England, and in America, they were huge, weren't they? They were number one albums, big singles. Like My Fire was number 1 for 5 weeks in America, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Where in England, they were more of a big cult band. They had a couple of singles, got to the edge of the top 20. They played the Roundhouse once, and it wasn't until Apocalypse Now came out that most people really clicked the Doors, in my generation anyway. I think that coming in after punk, people got the rebelliousness of them, and and that's combining with that feeling coming out of punk, and it's an escape route out of punk, especially a track like The End, which when you see it in Apocalypse Now is one of the great sort of moments in the film, and it's a perfect match of visual and music, and it's an amazing song, and it's so dark and brooding, and all those drones in it. It's just so perfect, isn't it? Yeah. And they became, nearly everybody interviewing that book, they will talk about the Doors somewhere in an interview,
Yeah, it was in. Well, that I was listening to LA Woman today, and I was thinking that it's kind of must have been big in Germany because it's very crowdy. That song, Anyway, but yeah, a lot of
the Krautrock thing was mainly from the Velvets, wasn't it? From the
probably
repetition plus a lot of other factors. But I'm sure, people always, with Krautrock, people always forget that they were hippies with all those bands. Now because it become so cool, I think people think they were like sort of cool hipsters making that music, but they were all like kind of long hairs living in farms, weren't they?
They were terrorists too.
Yeah.
The Amendoul, lived in Commune 1, which was where the Baader-Meinhof group were hanging out.
Yeah. And a great band as well.
Yeah,
if you're going to have a revolution, you've got to have a good soundtrack, haven't you?
Absolutely.
Which is what you've been working on for years,
That's
isn't
right.
it?
That's right. So as far as there's this void in scholarship or kind of popular scholarship about this music scene, but which is like amassing more and more fans, generations and generations of fans. It's getting bigger and bigger, and then suddenly now there's a bunch of books, possibly sparked by the rumor of your book. There's a bunch of new goth books coming out.
It's a little frustrating.
It's like that Yardbird song, there's a certain girl, or I guess that's a Ernie K. Doe song.
I was thinking Shape of Things to Come. Yeah.
Oh no, well, yeah.
It fits in the context.
But the thing about your book is I feel like it's gonna really shine through because it's so comprehensive, and you go all the way back to the fall of Rome, and you really, you talk about the original Goths, who were a tribe originally from Gotland, Sweden.
They're your people.
Yeah,
Aren't you half Swedish?
That's right. I am. Yeah, that's right. but they, they were all over the place. They were in Spain, everywhere. The Goths, like the Celts and like all these tribes that, dispersed everywhere. And they, eventually they smashed Rome, so they destroyed civilization, and you're drawing a correlation between that and the kind of, what the Goths did, which is, was a refutation of kind of, order and, and meaning, because punk is trying to make, what punk was turning into is this kind of system of morality and blah, blah, blah. And Goth is kind of a rejection of that, because it's about this kind of, some poetic higher truth or something, or that's what I was thinking when
it is, but it's also very much part of punk. Growing up in that period in England, it was just a development. It's just another line that punk took, because punk was so powerful. For very few people, it wasn't like a whole. When they always see the documentaries, go, the whole generation of kids got into punk. It wasn't really like that. There's about 3 people in each school got into it. But it's all their journeys afterwards that are interesting. So some people go two-tone, some people go goth, some people go second wave punk. So punk was basically just a lot of question marks thrown into middle pop culture, and you had to work out your own answer, didn't you? So one of those answers would be goth. And a lot of the people in the original goth scene, it was called alternative music at that time, alternative music playing alternative clubs. But I don't think most people actually thought they were in a different scene. They still thought this is punk, innit? So when I interview like Bauhaus, and I did a very in-depth interview with their amazing guitar player Daniel Ash, to him, to this day, he still thinks in terms of Bauhaus really being a punk band, and they were a great punk band. You go and see their early gigs, and they're really visceral and really exciting. It was just another version of punk. I think the thing with punk was that people didn't really understand how to do it, so they made their own version of it up. And that's what was great about it, wasn't it? It was so DIY, and people fumbling in the dark, and it becomes a very honest reaction to something that's thrown out there, doesn't it?
Yeah. Well, so that's interesting. So the parameters of goth are so broad, and it captures the imagination of so many different people. I've actually been in Leipzig, Germany, 2 times by chance
When the goth
during
festival's
the
on.
goth
festival,
and it's incredible when you see the variety of goth types, because because in Leipzig there's these streetcars, and the streetcars, it'll be like 4 carriages, and each one is just packed with goths, and but some of them are kind of like Edwardian, or some of them are some of them are more Elizabethan. Mm-hmm. And then there's kind of like future, like people in rubber with spiked, it's such a broad range of, things that people. So it's a little like,
but that's
it's like Christianity.
Yeah, lots of sex. Yeah. Well, I think that happens in all kind of cultures, doesn't it? They do subdivide and keep on subdividing, don't they? So because eventually everyone gets their own interpretation of it, don't they? So every band that starts in a scene, because it eventually ends up completely different from all the other bands. So you can't help yourself by being different, can you?
Yeah.
And also there's a striving for an individuality within the community as well. And it is a community, and it's communal, isn't it? Like all the music scenes are. But everyone's just trying to find their own tiny little space in it, aren't they?
Yeah.
And also everyone's in it. I always think the stuff that people brought in initially before punk, everyone's fascinations, for about the big bang of punk, then you've got about 6 months where that's it, everything's punk rock. And afterwards, the stuff you liked before starts mixing in with it, and it starts to become something else. So, like, even the book, like different towns and different cities had different answers to the punk question, So, Liverpool was always very interested in West Coast, this West Coast psychedelia. There's always a little play on words that we often talk about when we talk about Liverpool, because that's West Coast of England. But that's a very different West Coast. And here, because it's always pissing with rain and it's cold, but they had a West Coast psychedelia with their own interpretation, which had a darkness to it. Manchester was more post-industrial. Joy Division were kind of leading everyone out that way. And Leeds embraced rock music, and you end up with Sisters of Mercy, who did this amazing kind of pastiche of rock and a celebration of rock at the same time, but with a drum machine, which no rock band at that point in time, had used. I mean, obviously Suicide had used a drum machine, but I don't count them as being a rock band. I count them as being something so pure and genius and so out of space that you can't possibly put Suicide into any kind of musical niche, can you?
Well, it's actually interesting because Suicide, if you really think of when they start during the rock revival, the Sha-na-na kind of glam rock revival. And if you really think about Alan Vega, he's not that far from Alvin Stardust. So,
You're saying that's a good thing.
yeah, I mean,
Actually, I'm really amazed you know who Alvin Stardust is. I mean, Alvin Stardust can't have registered in America.
but
I mean, when My Cuckoo came out, that was like, for 1 week, he was like the coolest person at school. And then, there was always like every week, because Top of the Pops in England was the key program. So every week you watch Top of the Pops. And in the 70s, and we'll have to talk about glam rock in a minute because it's so important. So obviously Bowie and Bolan are great. But it's all the other stuff that was like really influential. And everyone talks about it through the book. So Alvin Stardust, I'm sure, is in there somewhere. And then there was a great Sparks moments when Sparks turned up on Top of the Pops, and it just totally freaked everyone out. And no one had any idea they'd been going for 5 years at that point in time. It just seemed like they come from outer space in that moment of time and appear from nowhere, and just the way they look like and what they sound like. So that, see, in England they were huge. Sparks, they had This Town was number 2 in the charts. It was a massive hit. They're still a cult band over here, aren't they? I mean, what do they say about Sparks? They're like the greatest British band ever produced by America. Which we kind of get slightly off tangent there, but the glam thing was like super important. I think really most of the people in this book are the children of Ziggy Stardust.
Yeah. Well, okay. So tell me about your definition of goth. Like, how would you, like, if you were, I don't know, if you were telling somebody, just some, merchant marine or, or some, or some, I don't know, some, Polish banker, what goth was.
These days, Polish bankers are probably
They
goths.
probably are goths. Okay, that's right.
Underneath the suits, but I know what you mean. Well, there's what you could actually distill it all down to one word, or you could actually extrapolate it all out to 160,000 words, which is the book. But if you want it in one word, you would just say black.
Yeah.
So the music's got a darkness to it. The clothes are generally quite dark, and there's a dark vibe to it. But that's oversimplifying it, because I think it's much more nuanced than that, isn't it? There's always that thing that people. Another thing I wanted to do in the book was also break down the cliche of it. People have this idea there was just a bunch of miserable kids, the face painted white, black hair, in a club moping around. It was nothing like that. The clubs are like incredibly decadent. Everyone's having a really great time. The music had a melancholy to it, but people were totally capable of embracing very dark music and having a great time doing it. Because you can hold two opposing thoughts in your mind at the same time. It's not that rigid, is it? And the fluidity of goth is important. Fluidity in everything, like sexually, clothes-wise, music-wise, even attitude-wise. I think that's all very important. Because isn't that the greatest politic maybe of pop culture? That space where you could be anything you want. Yeah. It doesn't have to have a manifesto, does it?
But maybe you could define it by what it isn't, which is it's not explicitly political.
But there is political people in there. So
like
Sister Mercy, Andrew Eldridge, he wouldn't do interviews. Well, he does do interviews actually. He said he did say when I interviewed him, he will never put the record out unless Donald Trump got in power. At that point in time, when nobody thought Donald Trump would ever get in power, and then he did become the president, and everyone's going, well, you're going to have to put a record out now after 30 years. So he disappeared again after that. So he's political. He has political lyrics, but it's not like. So I would argue that most punk isn't actually that political. So there's an idea that everything in punk is political, and there is politics in punk, a lot of great politics in punk, but also a lot of punk bands weren't the slightest bit political at all.
Yeah, of course.
So Anarchy in the UK, which is one of the great songs ever written, isn't really a manifesto for anarchy. It's probably just a sound of being 18 and that 6 months of your life when you do live like an anarchist. You just do what the fuck you like because you're a selfish teenage brat, but it's fucking great, isn't it? That's like none of the rest of your life will ever be as good as that point of time, and I think that's political as well.
But I guess what I mean is this aesthetically political. Like the UK subs, like they might not be political, but there's the idea that all the kind of real life, the dole and, all this kind of, the themes. I guess the themes.
Different themes. There's a different
themes.
take on it, because maybe in goth, it's not saying it's political, but if you went to a club, it was a space where you could be yourself, which I think is a very political statement, isn't it? And it was a place where, and this would sound very hopelessly old-fashioned, but I remember clubs in England, girls go in the boys' toilets and boys goes in the girls' toilets. I know that's not a revolution, with like say nowadays, with sexuality and stuff like that. But then in England, that was quite something. It's like, whoa, Jesus, So it's and also the women could be quite masculine and the men could be quite feminine, and that was quite revolutionary as well. So I think they're always the best type of pop politics, and that was what's getting played out in Goth, but not as a thing, not as a statement, just because people wanted to be who they were. They wanted to play with themselves as what they were as well. I think those are political statements that would really work,
Yeah.
I think as soon as people sing a manifesto, it just switches people off, doesn't it? If you suggest things or you create a space where things can happen, it's quite political. And I think that's what you would find in Goth.
So what inspired you to write this?
And like I was saying before, I think there's a space and it had to be done. I think it had to be unpacked, and also a celebration. I think it's important to celebrate these bands. So for ages, I'd read stuff about the post-punk period, and Simon Reynolds, who I'm seeing tomorrow, actually wrote that brilliant book about post-punk. But all the bands I wrote about in my book, they had about like a very small chapter in there. And I thought, well, there's definitely going to be a book on this, because the way my memory remembers it, the Killing Joke or Bauhaus,
Killing Joke.
Amazing
They
bands.
and they were really huge, and they're kind of forgotten.
They're remembered. The people remember. People know them, don't they? But I know what you mean. They're not celebrated enough. And I think somebody had to like recalibrate this. Like the Fall are great, Gang of Four are great, but so were Bauhaus and so were Killing Joke. And most of us growing up at that period of time liked all those bands anyway. Didn't split them into little subsections. And they're all equally influential, especially to musicians.
Well, that's an interesting thing about rock history and the half-life of the
so
groups,
edited, isn't it? Yeah.
And which ones survive and which ones are kind of like dismissed and forgotten, and it's quite interesting.
I don't even understand the process. I've been writing about music for 40 odd years, and I really don't understand why some bands aren't allowed in and other bands are pushed out. There's so many bands. I mean, like punk. There's a lot of punk bands get written out of history, but definitely a lot of goth bands. I mean, and when I say goth, it's loose term goth, but a band like Bauhaus, they used to get terrible press. The reviews, nearly every review was really awful, really slagging them off. The only way they got their music out there was because obviously in the UK was John Peel. John Peel played them a lot, and that's probably how they found their audience. And also because when they toured, because it was so intense live and so exciting, they definitely picked up a lot of people on the punk scene as well,
Yeah, the history, it seems to have a lot to do with the class too. What sort of people are writing about the music and what sort of people like the music. Do you know what I mean?
I think it's fair enough that people reflect their own little worlds that they're in. If you're a writer, you reflect the music you like and your scene that you're in. But I think the problem is that they're always the same scenes, isn't it? It's like you never hear in England. You never hear like rock music on the radio. Like Six Music's great, but they don't play rock music. So a lot of the really cutting edge music now, where music's actually changing into like different shapes and sounds, is on the fringes of metal. That's where all the cool weird stuff's happening. But that's never celebrated either. It's the same with these bands in here as well. So when you listen to something like Bela Lugosi's Dead, it's a remarkable piece of music. I think people get so used to it. As being a great piece of music you hear in a club a lot or whatever, or you see in a film soundtrack, take one step back and listen, you think, wow, that is a really odd piece of music, like a 9-minute dark dub jam. It's just, as your first single, is a pretty ambitious, as as a musician, that's putting out a 9-minute track as your first song is quite a weird move. You've probably done it every single project you've been in, but it's not something you do as a commercial move, is it?
No.
And it's a really original piece of music, so I can't really think of anything that sounded really like it before either. It should have been celebrated, but at the time it just got really slagged off, and that annoyed me. Now I thought, well, I want to celebrate these people. And I think, like I talked about Daniel Ash before, I think he is an amazing guitar player. He went to art school and he plays guitar like painting the palettes. They're all like little colours and textures, and I like that idea, as well. I think what was great about punk, because it was so simple, is taking music back to simplicity and the claustrophobia of it. It was very claustrophobic music, and it's intense, it's in your face. I love all that. But what was great about punk, about goth, or this end of post-punk, was it opened everything out and it celebrated the space, and and you could get the same amount of excitement out of something without everyone playing all at once.
Yeah. One thing I think is interesting is you're from Manchester, and you talk about Johnny Marr managing this goth shop, or this kind of, like what was, I guess, a punk shop, and it's interesting because you could almost see, it's sort of this term, and it's like, oh well, why didn't it suck in the Smiths? Do you know what I mean? Because nobody would call the Smiths a goth band, but you could.
But a lot of goths like the Smiths.
Yeah,
because there's a melancholy to the Smiths, which. So I don't think there was never, like now, of course, it's a Spotify playlist, who's in and who's out. It's, the algorithms.
It's like Northern Soul. What's Northern Soul?
Well, Northern Soul was
Belgian popcorn.
Northern Soul was a complete construct. Isn't
it?
Yeah. It was just fast soul records they played in northern clubs because the northern mods took more speed than they did in the south. And and Dave Godin came up there, didn't he? And he went to the Twisted Wheel and he goes, "Wow, all these records are really fast. They seem to have a different northern soul scene." That's how the term came about, wasn't it? It was like nobody ever actually made a northern soul record ever, did they? So. And it's the same. I'll probably say with this, isn't it? No, I don't think all these bands and
nobody made a goth record.
Until
the term got codified way later.
Yeah, then sometimes I know sometimes that simplifies the music, and you get to second, third, fourth wave bands, and people always say they're not as interested because they're working with the parameters of the first wave bands. But sometimes they can be really good as well. And sometimes the cliches are what's great about it. But all of the original bands, and I do a chapter on all the key bands, the key pillars of goth, really, and. They all sound really different from each other, and they're working with. There's a vague template, but I think they were fumbling in the dark, literally fumbling in the dark. I don't think they had an idea that this is a goth record. None of them formed as goth bands, and none of them knew what a goth record was. They were just making. It was in that period after punk where people were trying to find a space. I mean, like the Cure. The Cure went in a really weird route.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, they started off as their first album's very John Peel show, and it was. They're almost like there's a brave new world of post-punk pop, so they almost fitted somewhere between XTC and Wire, the Cure, when they started with a little bit of Buzzcocks in there, and then Joy Division obviously was a slight influence on them. The second, third album got that Joy Division vibe, and then they went into that glorious abyss of pornography, and then they turn into this kind of Syd Barrett kind of sort of lysergic pop, having massive hits. It's a really odd route, but when you listen to it all together, one gig, when they do one of those amazing 3-hour shows, it actually all fits together.
Yeah. Well, I always thought when I was young that if, the Cure didn't have those haircuts, they wouldn't have been goth.
Yeah, they kind of became, it's true though, they kind of became a goth band in a sense, didn't they? But that's because Robert Smith played in the Banshees, and I think he learnt a lot playing in the Banshees. So when the Banshees had that mad split, which I write about in the book, on the second album tour, when Kenny Morris and John McKay left the band, and they had to get Robert Smith. The Cure was supporting them on the tour. So on the third gig of the tour, they split up the Banshees. So on the 8th gig of the tour, they reconvened. Robert Smith played all the guitar parts, and he was in the Banshees, and he's in the Banshees for quite, not a massive stretch of time, but long enough for it to really influence him. And I think his look kind of changes then as well. So I think the Banshees are. I mean, I think it'd be impossible to be in the Banshees and not be influenced by the whole aesthetic, wouldn't it?
Well, I mean, but that's an interesting thing, because if you think of, what is like the defining feature of punk is really like the haircut, much more than the music. So
I would say that's a good thing.
No, I do too. I don't think that there should be. I don't think that music or musical style should necessarily be more important than than a cut of clothing or whatever. I don't know why one is considered more.
As an English person, I would think that. You see,
yeah.
So you're actually a bit of an anomaly as an American, because this is a very big generalisation, but most American bands will wear the T-shirt with a cockroach spray on it or something, cheap pair of jeans, and you look at the picture, you can't tell what style of music they are. But I remember the first time I'd seen pictures of the Sex Pistols, I knew what they sounded like from looking at the picture, and they hadn't even put a record out then. So in England, the clothes, and this is a generalisation, I know I'm exaggerating here, but the clothes are important in England. It's dressing up. So you're really on the wrong side of the Atlantic in a sense. Yeah. You would have worked perfectly in England, because you get that equation right from the Nation Ulysses. All the bands have a slightly different sartorial thing going on, which fits the music. Like
Thanks
Sister
for noticing.
the first thing the Sister Mercy did, Andrew Eldritch designed the logo, which is the classic logo on all the T-shirts, before they wrote a song.
Yeah.
I think that tells you an awful lot about British pop culture and also about people I'm writing about in the book as well. You know,
Yeah.
a lot of those bands would have imagined what they looked like before they started writing a song and things, and I think that's totally cool. I think it's the 360, isn't it? You know, any kind of the best pop cultures are, they're like when you go see a great band, it's a world to get lost in, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah. Well, so what were the most insightful interviews that you did for the book?
Well, I think Eldridge is always good because he's very, very smart and he's funny. I mean, my favourite quote he gave me, and he didn't do an interview for this book because he actually despises the term goth. So there's no way I could ring him up and say, do you want to do an interview for a goth book? He wouldn't do that. But I interviewed him the year before, and it's such a good interview, I had to use it. But he said, my terror is other people's idea of entertainment. And I said, if you ever do another album, that should be the title. It's such a great, you can see it on the T-shirt in a circle, can't you, going around there. I really like Gavin Friday, Virgin Prunes. That was a really good interview, because he's the same age as me, Gavin Friday, so he'd gone through a lot of the same things in that same order. So he was a big Bowie fan, and he said he went to see Bowie play in London in 1975, and he's in Dublin, when at that time Dublin was a very conservative city, you know, because the country was conservative, because the church ran that country, you know. And I just watched the Sinead O'Connor documentary, was gone about that as well. It's powerful, brilliant documentary, but it has some of the same themes in it, you know. And so he put on his best outfits to go and watch Bowie, big pair of cream flares, a little tank top, you know, very mid-70s fashion, went there, and he got to the gig and the Bromley contingent walked past him, and he instantly felt like he's from the wrong century. So they went back to Dublin and recreated their own version of it with his best friend Bono, you know. So it's they created this thing called the Lipton Village. It's a imaginary village where they could just be who they wanted. Walked around the streets of Dublin in dresses with eyeliner on, freaking everybody out. And what I argue in that chapter, and again, it's probably quite pretentious, but I quite like this idea, is the revolution that changes Ireland from this stuffy conservative country that it was at the time to this it's a brilliant place now. You know, everywhere you go in Ireland, there's so much great culture, amazing music scene, so many great bands. It all starts at that point in time when they're walking down the street with their 10 mates with these kind of crazy names they all made up for each other, all really dressed up. You know, the power of the clothes, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah.
And then they made the music to match. So the Virgin Prunes, they had two bands in the Lipton Village. It's not a real place, it's an imaginary village. One band was the art band in the village, and the other band was the commercial band, and they played it out in real life. You know, one ends up being the Virgin Prunes, who are an amazing band. So I don't know if people haven't heard them, go and Spotify them later. You know, their stuff is incredible. It sounds more contemporary now than it even did at the time. And the other band's U2. So when I did Dublin the other week, Gavin did the interview like you're doing it tonight and stuff, and it just suddenly occurred to me in the middle of the interview that I always felt a bit sad that Virgin Prunes hadn't got as big as U2. Of course, I live in an imaginary world like you do, you know, where the little bands should have been big. It's all upside down. But then when I realised that with Zeropa, the U2 had turned into the Virgin Prunes, that Gavin had turned U2 into the Virgin Prunes, the number one album all around the world, because he sounds like the Virgin Prunes and looks like the Virgin Prunes, and he sneaked it through. So he did get into popular culture in the end. So maybe that'll happen to you in the end.
Yeah. So, should we ask people questions, or do you want to talk to...
That's a good idea. Instead of them asking us questions, we can ask them questions.
Yeah.
We can turn it back to front.
So what do you guys think? Well, actually, what conclusion did you come to in the book about what was the conclusion? What's that? Yeah, what's the epilogue say?
I didn't do an epilogue. Shit. I'll have to type one out now.
Okay, we can ask some questions.
There's two strands I found quite interesting. One, there's a lot of these bands came from really sort of dead towns, small towns where nothing much was going on, and people came up with this really exotic culture in really like bland places. It was amazing, like Bauhaus for Northampton, or even the time like Leeds, which is a big city where Sisters came from, didn't really have any musical culture in there at all, you know. And the first goth club in the world was in Leeds. It was the Phono in Leeds. It's not the Batcave, which is more famous, but it actually was in Leeds, and they're very, very precious about that, as they should be, you know. And there's always kind of amazing goth clubs in weird little towns where you think, wow, Wakefield's got a club. I mean, nothing ever goes on there apart from Bebop Deluxe, who were pretty amazing. So it's all this kind of like.
So maybe that's why Goth didn't get a kind of more.
Yeah, because it wasn't metropolitan as well.
Yeah, it's more working class and outlying.
I think it was middle class and working class. I think class didn't matter in Goth. It's just if you were the freaky kid, wherever you came from, you were welcome. But it was in outlying towns, and the clubs were really important. So these clubs were like safe havens for all the the 28 local freaks and that. So that was really interesting. It was an outlying culture, which actually played out over the years, hasn't it? So even like in America to this day, as you tour across America to those weird little towns in the middle of nowhere, you get these amazingly freaky looking people. Think, wow, they've actually done something amazing in a space. But this is pre-internet, so how do people work all this out? Writing letters to each other or something. And the other thing I thought was really amazing was starting with Rome and going to this day. There's a historical perspective to it, probably more than any other type of music. It was like every generation is kind of dealing with its blues. So in the 18th century, you would have written. You'd been Thomas de Quincey walking around Manchester in an opium dream, writing a book, or you'd be a poet, or you'd be like Lord Byron, mad, bad, and dangerous to know. Isn't that the most greatest Gothic slogan of all time? Right, having a ghost story competition in Lake Geneva. Yeah. But in late 70s, early 80s, the most available art form to us all was guitar, bass, drums, rock and roll. And it played out on there. Whereas now, a lot of Gothic themes play out on the internet, so you get Goth influencers on YouTube or Instagram who don't really listen to music. They just like the style and the look, and to me that's okay, because they're an 18-year-old like influencer on Instagram now doing a picture standing in the middle of a forest in the pouring rain, dressed in amazing clothes, is the same as an 18th century painter painting the same forest probably. Yeah. It's just a modern version of it. So the theme of Goth and the idea of it and the fascination with sex and death and the dark side or whatever plays out in every generation with different technology. So that's the two things. That's my epilogue. I should have typed it out. Oh yeah.
Okay, does anyone have any questions? Any just I don't know.
So my question for you is, through the process of writing the book, was there anything you learned that surprised you? Like, was there anything you came across that put some pieces together for you, or anything that just sparked your interest?
But probably it's funny because people always ask me that. Yeah. The thing is more of an override thing, like I was just saying then about how I kind of knew, because I grew up through all this stuff, so I remember all the bands coming up in real time, and I've seen a lot of those bands in the early days, but it was that realisation a lot of them came from kind of very odd places. It wasn't, the way the story was told originally was like this. In Britain, the pop culture is always like London gives the country all these great things, and we're so grateful, and it isn't really like that at all. And by the time you get to this, it's small towns doing really amazing stuff, and that was interesting. That's what we celebrated. There weren't bumpkins in little towns. People in little towns had a very sophisticated pop culture and a very original pop culture, and it was their own pop culture, which I think is one of the reasons that it probably wasn't embraced by the music media initially. The London-based music media didn't really get what was going on in those little towns. They had their own thing going on, and and some of the stuff they celebrate, which of course is great. But they didn't really get this other stuff that's coming out like Northampton or Leeds or whatever. Just see where's that coming from. So there wasn't so much a surprise. It was just it's probably a slight realisation or recalibration of things that you realise at the time of things. Even like The Cure. I mean, they came from Crawley, which is like a nowhere new town. It's only 30 miles from London, but 30 miles in LA is like going to a cafe, innit? But 30 miles in England. I mean, Liverpool and Manchester 30 miles apart, and people from Manchester never go to Liverpool, It's like, that would seem bizarre here, wouldn't it? But in England, because everything's so squashed, 30 miles suddenly could seem like 300 miles. But in the late 70s, early 80s, it would seem even further, the idea of going that distance.
So it's almost the actual geography of the area what sort of made it the way it was?
I think yes, it's always that thing, is it nature or nurture, isn't it? But it's interesting, isn't it? And I do, like I said before, there's certain cities did have a different aspect of the journey coming out of punk, so Liverpool did get into that. The Doors are always really popular in that Liverpool in the late 70s, so not all the bands, even really unlikely bands like Dead or Alive. Pete Burns was another Jim Morrison acolyte, initially when he was in the bands.
Echo and the Bunnymen.
Yeah, well, the Bunnymen's the obvious one, isn't it? Yeah. But, Teardrop Explodes, they're massive into the door. I think obviously because Julian Cope was super nerdy on his music, so he's getting into bands like the Seeds, who are influential, but they were quite unknown in England in the 70s and early 80s. There's only people like Julian Cope would know about them. But Liverpool, in Manchester as well, slightly a bit of Dorsing. Ian Curtis obviously had a Dorsing going on. In fact, when I interviewed Hooky in the book, and he was saying that very early on, one of the first reviews of Joy Division, the reviewer said they sounded like the Doors, and he said to Ian Curtis, "What the fuck do the Doors sound like?" He had no idea. Ian Curtis lent him a record. This is how the Doors weren't that big in England. They were a bit cult size. He played the record. He goes, "Fuck me, we do sound like the Doors." He had no realisation of it because Hooky said he was into the only into music that his mates had told him about. Is he was really into John Cale, but he never heard of the Velvet Underground. So when he was 16, because of course now you could just Google all this, but then of course it is just little strands of information, isn't it? Now it's easy to get a grasp, do a crash course in pop culture, isn't it? You could do it in a month on your laptop, but then it was if your local record shop didn't have that record, you would never know that record existed, or if you were 18 in the town and you were the oldest kid on the scene, there was no 22-year-old to lend you a Can record or something, you wouldn't even know it existed. So Peter Hook was, when he says all that, it does sound funny, but of course it's understandable because you couldn't get the stuff. Iggy Pop in England wasn't really that known till David Bowie did the Berlin records. The Stooges was so cult. It was they often say that there was 2 kids into the Stooges in every town in Britain, and they formed all the original punk bands.
Anybody else?
Oh, shall we go? He was first, I think.
Sure.
Yeah. I think it was less so. I think it was less of a concern. But even that backlash against punk bands signed to major labels is a total joke because all the original punk bands were on major labels. At my age, my grand old age of 62, I loved punk originally because it was pop music and it was in the charts and it changed your life. It wasn't, growing up in a place called Blackpool where I grew up, you wouldn't know about the Clash unless they're on CBS. It'd be impossible to know they even existed. All the underground stuff that came later on when we were at grand old age 19 or 20, we knew where to get the records then. But when you're 15 or 16, the Sex Pistols will change your life because they were on a major label. They had proper hit records. They were number one in England, well they should have been, but they were cheated out of the chart position. But so I had no problem being on major labels, and so it's a bit so. That thing about people selling out is to me is a bit of a joke. Really. In fact, there's a great Clash documentary. I don't know if anyone's seen it, where they asked Mick Jones about selling. Have you sold out? And he goes, and I'll just do his voice, but I can't do it that way. He goes, selling out, right? You put a gig on. There's 3,000 tickets. You sell them all. You sold out, haven't you? Which is totally true, and it's not. It's great they were popular. I thought, why don't we just fill the world up with good shit instead of bad shit? I don't like musical snobbery. I hate it when the good stuff ends up playing in a room to 20 people. It annoys me. It annoys me when I have to do it myself, but it annoys me even more when I watch other people doing it. I think, like watching his band. In fact, they did well in Manchester, right? They had a good crowd in there. But I'm watching his band play and think there should be 1,000 people in here. It was 200. It was packed and it was a great gig, right? And it's great that, and it's all your mates there, and that's lovely, isn't it? I think if we're ever going to make the world any better, we need to get more than 200 people on board, and it's hard work on an independent label. So was there a backlash? There would have been sometimes. I think sometimes people resent it when their little favourite band, when their little brother likes it as well, their little sister likes it, which is so snooty, isn't it? Or maybe the music has changed and they don't like the way the band's music changes as they go along, But then it's like the Cure thing. They went through so many different stages, and they seem so different from each other, all the stages. But when you watch it in the context of a gig now, it all makes complete sense. It's a musical journey, isn't it? But I'm probably speaking out of turn here because I've never had a problem with stuff being popular. David Bowie was popular in the major label in the 70s, and he was the game changer, wasn't he? If David Bowie had been putting his own records out, we wouldn't be talking about him now. There is a flip side to that, isn't it? Of course, major labels will tell you what to do all the time, but a lot of bands stand up to that, don't they? And the other flip side of that is a lot of underground labels. People are trapped within niche scenes where they're also getting told what to do, aren't they? By very stern-faced young men, aren't they? Your band can't do this.
Oh.
which is the reason why everyone hates the term goth, isn't it? Because they get trapped inside a little cliche, isn't it?
So I have a question before we take it back to the audience. Wait, before, sorry to talk out of turn, but the whole idea of style and groups and their style and aesthetic, and the fact that we've basically determined that goth is more an aesthetic proposal than an actual difference from punk or rock and roll or whatever. It's or that it's primarily an aesthetic thing, is that without the record cover in the digital age, without a record cover, can these differences really even be identified?
I think probably not as instantly, but you do get record covers though, don't you? You can still, even if you're playing a piece of music on your phone, the artwork's still there with even more pixels.
But when you put your record on a TuneCore or whatever, they have all these stipulations. They're like if you submit a record cover that is where it's not, like, let's say it's kind of vague, like what the, basically you have to just have the record band name and then the title, and it has to be really uncomplicated.
I think, of course, it will change you because you don't get the aesthetic or the background to it. But people won't, and I actually wish I could do that. I wish I could listen to everything as an 18-year-old out of context, because it would be quite fascinating, wouldn't it? But maybe the music still connects to people because it's still got an atmosphere to it or an emotion to it that connects in that kind of way.
I guess I'm just wondering if a subculture, which goth starts as a subculture, if a subculture can exist in the digital age, because now goth exists, it's institutionalized, it's a thing that we agree exists, and it's existed for a long time. But can something like that develop in an age without these, physical artifacts that are really key to, why is, Bauhaus different than, the other band? It's, it's a big part of it's the graphics and the what's proposed by the graphics and by the typeface and, blah, blah, blah. And those things just exist. They're much less, of a thing in the digital age.
They aren't because, in fact, you probably have more information thinking about it because you could just Google the whole thing.
Yeah, but then you've kind of got this, it's just a big, wait, don't leave, I'll stop talking. No. Well, anyway, let's ask somebody else a question, that's fine.
It was interesting, that. Oh, wait, so I have to do this in order. Was it? Oh, yeah, it's you on it, yeah. With the dog. What's the dog called?
Oh, this is Honey.
Honey. Hello, Honey.
She's a fan.
Need to dye the dog black.
I know. I'm gonna get her like a studded collar.
Like a dog collar, literally. Yeah.
I was gonna ask, what do you think? Because you mentioned a lot of people in bands who really resist the term goth and don't want to, classified under that. What do you think about that and why?
Yeah. So what she's asking is, what do I think of people who don't like, the bands don't like to call themselves goth? I totally understand it. Why would Susie Sue want to get locked into a scene at Rise 6 years after her first gig, and then people saying, if you're the queen of goth, why are you not wearing black trousers? You get a bit goth police sometimes, or like any scene does, where people say what people have to do within that scene. An artist, a true artist, should be completely free to do what they want.
So I wanted to follow up with a question about the politics of goth, because Ian says it's not political. I feel like you said at least a lot of the players in the bands are progressive, maybe even anarchistic as a youth movement, right? But you also said it's aesthetic, it's an aesthetic movement primarily, and it looks very conservative, doesn't it? Almost like aristocrats living in a castle would be great, vampires. We've got to go back in time. It feels very modernist in some way, at least aesthetically. So why would they do that, and are there conservative?
Why should the aristocrats be the only people who can wear those clothes? There's in fact a lot of British culture, British pop culture, is about reclaiming the styles from the rich people, and so the mods was all about dressing smarter than your boss, wasn't it? So maybe, and I know nobody's ever actually said this, but maybe goth was about dressing more aristocratically than the aristocrats, if there's such a word.
But
You
also,
know?
aristocrats had, by the time of Goth, they don't have power anymore. Because the middle class, the bourgeoisie are not the aristocrats. The middle class is, the bourgeoisie is the middle class.
I mean, the great styles, aren't they? I mean, see in England also is a tradition of the dandy. People like dressing up. I think this got lost. Wood punk was about dressing up when it started, but after about 2 years, it's about dressing down. But initially, I think when most of these scenes start, they're about dressing up, so like aristocrats did. And I think, why? Like I said before, why should it only be aristocrats allowed to dress up? Maybe that's the revolution, isn't it? It's everyone saying we want our share as well. We're all the aristocrats, and just get rid of the real ones, isn't it? But there is a politic to it. There's a politics in some of the bands, but not all the bands. But there wasn't politics in all the punk bands either. If you look at the politics of the Ramones, it's a bit confusing, isn't it? And some of the other bands, the same, aren't they? Some of the other bands, punk could go from being very, very conservative to very left-wing to anarchistic to just songs about getting drunk, So I think these very, very broad brushstrokes and all these kind of scenes. I think it's quite a political statement. Like I said about the Virgin Prunes walking around Dublin wearing a dress and having eyeliner on in 1978 is a very powerful political statement. I don't think you have to have a manifesto to be political. You can actually just be walking down a street and it can change things. I mean, just go back in time and try doing it.
But,
it must take a nerves of steel.
But also, if you think, the French Revolution, it's, then you have the Thermidorian reaction. Maybe the Goths are like the incroyables.
This is why I asked Ian to do this.
Because the Robespierre is like chop off everybody's head, and then it became the thing to
That's totally genius. That's brilliant.
Well, this book looks really genius to me, and I think everybody should get a copy of it. I'm really excited to read it, and because of I think it looks. It just has a great overview, and it's not just this kind of catalog of, it's a work of art as opposed to, it's a work of art as opposed to a encyclopedia.
Well, thanks Ian, and thanks to everybody coming down.
Thank you, John. Thanks for having me here.